Ready? Okay.
Okay.
And 10.
Are you going to roll it back?
9,
Roll it back.
8.
Okay.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
On this edition of the Academics, two topics that won't seem to go away: climate change and mass shootings. Hello, I'm Paul Gates. Welcome to the Academics. Let me introduce our panel. To my right, Nancy Love of the university's Government and Justice Studies Department, and Michael Wade of the Appalachian History Department. It seems we've talked climate change to death. The same to do what to do about mass shootings. It appears we're beginning to make some slow progress regarding our stewardship of the planet, but the solutions to these seemingly senseless shootings still eludes us. So this week, let's talk about Paris, Colorado Springs, and San Bernardino. There seems to be reason for hope on climate change coming out of Paris this week. The president there, representatives from all the countries of the world. There seemed to be some agreement moving along. Mike, what do you think?
Well, I think there's some interesting wrinkles to this 21st meeting. For one thing, Pope Francis, on an airplane flight back from Africa, gave an interview to a journalist and directed at the attendees at the climate change conference. And said that humanity was on the verge of committing suicide if substantive action weren't taken quickly. The other thing, of course, is that in a new departure, the nations attending there are being asked to submit their own individual plans of action, which is a very good thing and probably should have been done some time ago. What's not heartening is American news coverage of the climate conference, consistent with its earlier treatment of the climate crisis, which is to say inadequate. On Monday, the NBC Evening News got to the midpoint of its half-hour program before it briefly treated the climate change conference and then moved along to its heartwarming human interest story at the end of the program. And NBC's tertiary coverage of a global meeting on the greatest threat to civilization in human history. And NBC's not alone. The rest of the American news media is equally irresponsible. In fact, they're really rivaled only by our political leadership when it comes to irresponsibility on the climate crisis. And that's where we are. We are at a point where we need our institutions and our political leadership to stand up and tell the truth and to talk about what needs doing.
So is this going to happen, Nancy? Mike's identified the problems, what needs to be done. What do you think?
I'm cautiously optimistic this time around, in part because multiple political leaders, including President Obama, have expressed their sentiments that transparency is crucial, which is what you're also saying, and that the political will may actually be here because of everything that has led up to this set of climate talks. And that includes something that received very little attention in the news media as well, which is President Obama's decision not to proceed with the Keystone XL pipeline, which was made on November 6th. But that was just a small blip, right, on the news screen. And yet that's a huge statement in terms of our capacity to exercise global leadership on climate change. And he recognized that.
This is not point counterpoint, but equally important, I think President Obama pledged $3 billion on the part of the United States toward a $100 billion pool of money to help developing nations develop alternative energy programs and to cope with rising sea level. The Republican Senate leadership promptly countered that they shouldn't spend the money because the Republican leadership intended to see to it that that money was never reached these nations. And we're back to our political paralysis here in this country, and I think paralysis is putting it kindly.
Well, I think that's the real sticking point, which is how do we compensate, right? Less developed nations who are suffering the effects of climate change and who are not able to adjust, if adjust is even the right word, right? If your nation is being submerged by rising sea levels, what financial compensation is reasonable for that? There's some things that money can't buy, and I think the developed world has to confront those consequences of our long-term delays, and that'll be crucial for developing not only the political will, but also the political trust.
Sure, well, those are problems that become immediately apparent when you have tiny islands in your nation that are at sea level or close to it, and the best of circumstances, life becomes unlivable in these countries. It's just not, you can't just give compensation, move somewhere else. You know, your country's gone.
You know, Elizabeth Colbert, whose book *The Sixth Extinction* just won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, said of the Republican Senate that given their concern about not having Syrian refugees, and given that the climate crisis will make the Syrian refugee crisis look like a blip on the radar in terms of climate refugees, maybe the Senate Republicans ought to be in a hurry to see that $3 billion is properly spent to mitigate things before they become overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, when we have perhaps a little bit of movement or hope for some movement in the political front, is this going to be helped along by what seems to be contemporaneously is the climate denier pool is shrinking a little bit. Will this be of assistance in having the people who need to step up?
Maybe. Frankly, I'm not sure how much political intelligence there is out there anymore. For example, do any of these people remember the Marshall Plan? Aid to post-war Europe, which rebuilt European economies, but also energized and underwrote a good portion of post-war American prosperity. There's money to be made in doing the right thing with regard to countries that are facing submersion. And on top of that, it's doing a good thing.
Sure. Well, and China's making that investment into renewables. They poured in way more money than we have, certainly, in wind and solar, and they've got no choice. I mean, they've got no other types of energy to fall back on. It's coal or renewables, and they've got to make the renewables choice.
What's required now is investment in the future, not investment in the past and the status quo. And that's where the stepping up needs to happen.
Good. Well, let's move on to something we've seen before. The shooting in Colorado first. I mean, and bring this one up next, not the most recent, but bring this one up next because of its slight connection with things going on in the Republican presidential campaign for the nomination. The shooter from, unfortunately, North Carolina makes statements at the time of his arrest about no more baby parts. A pretty direct reference, it seems, to the Planned Parenthood videos that Carly Fiorina decried in one of the Republican debates recently and have since been shown not to exist. So, where does this take us with this making up facts? What do we do about that?
Right. Well, the GOP candidates are having a tough time positioning themselves in relation to the Planned Parenthood shootings because they need to work out some complicated balance between condemning the shootings and offering condolences to the victims and some policy that may work to prevent future such incidents without, in this case, seeming to endorse Planned Parenthood and a pro-choice agenda. And then Carly Fiorina has not recognized the power of her words, right? At the No More Baby Parts, the video to which you're referring to, she has pivoted to try to position herself as the victim of leftist attempts to link the tragedy to abortion opponents and denied the power of her baby parts comment in influencing this obviously deeply troubled shooter. But other candidates as well. You know, Ted Cruz ignored the body parts comment and commented that the shooter was a transgendered leftist activist, seemingly coming out of nowhere. I understand there is...
Well, it is coming out of nowhere
Well, there is
because it's not so.
There is perhaps a mistake on a driver's license form that the shooter had filled out, but we'll let that go. That's not the point. Ben Carson has blamed both sides as if they're equal for extremist rhetoric. Donald Trump has talked about the shooting as a terrible thing, but then has pivoted to blaming Parenthood for making his supporters anxious and angry. And Mike Huckabee, who did call it mass murder, then immediately linked it to Planned Parenthood, saying that they were doing the same thing with babies. These are not equivalent events, and where everyone stands on the abortion issue, for most women, it is not an easy decision to make. And to need to go to a Planned Parenthood clinic wearing a bulletproof vest with a police escort and potentially need a safe room, when Planned Parenthood is also providing reproductive health services and prenatal care.
Which is most of their activities.
Yeah, yeah.
The vast majority of their money is spent on things other than abortion.
We have left reality far behind.
In the political season, you know, the primary season anyway, the Republicans, obviously every party has to do this, is they're trying to get further to the right of each other. I mean, there's so many of them staking out all these bizarre positions that as you head further to the right, the positions get weirder and weirder. But this is different. We haven't seen it to this extent before.
I think this whole business, the political response, it goes to what I said earlier about political intelligence. All right, so Fiorina said it. The others all want to see where to position themselves so as to perhaps gain from the incident. And we get the kinds of responses that Nancy just outlined. Well, who's loonier? Carly Fiorina or the person who takes her seriously? The person who believes her, obviously. But regarding Ms. Fiorina, let's not talk lunacy, let's talk honesty. Yeah. She says she actually viewed the baby parts video and her remarks perhaps inspired a demented Tar Heel to commit mass murder in Colorado. By the way, has Eduardo Cruz seen a picture of this guy? You couldn't possibly say that he was transgendered if you had. But back to Ms. Fiorina. She either did see the video or she's an outrageous, conniving, pandering, pathological liar of the first magnitude. So why not?
I take it you think it's the latter, Mike.
First magnitude. So why not stand up and say, produce the video forthwith with verifiable provenance that that's not made up on the spot, and or be permanently shouted from the stage by her presumably more forthright competition for the GOP nomination. let's put an end to this this kind of garbage once and for all. And I dare say that the person honest enough to do it probably will soar in the
And who's that going to be, Nancy? Who's going to step up like that and risk the wrath of, you know, this being a left-wing attack, to question the veracity of Carly Fiorino's statements?
I don't know, and it's the right question to ask, because someone needs to
It
step
doesn't
up.
even require that much bravery, because if you're, you know, if somebody says, well, it's leftist, no. We're just asking to see the video. Don't we all want to see it? And if it's not there, then this lady is a liar, and we don't want her in our company.
This would be the kid that points out that the emperor has no clothes. It's is it politically possible? You know, it's an easy solution and it's the right solution, but can it happen?
Now, if you phrase it that way to Donald Trump, there's just no telling what he would say next.
Well, that's for sure.
But the point is that the moral truth is not on the left or the right.
No.
And it's what the citizens of
it's
this
just the
country
truth,
deserve.
yeah.
And also that violent rhetoric contributes to violent acts.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed in Chris Christie. He's the type of guy who I would expect to stand up and say this.
Right, sure. He usually says what's on his mind.
Yeah.
And this would be a good time for him to exercise that habit that he has.
But I think there's a fear of real issues among that whole group. They don't want to get to anything where they might have to take a stand. That's not easy.
Right. Well, there's only right-wing positions to take at this point. I mean, they've already gone that far. Kind of hard to retreat at this point. They've taken it extreme, and there's not too much extreme left, it seems to me.
Yeah, so go for honesty.
Okay, how about looking at another shooting, San Bernardino. This is getting to be an unfortunate, frequent occurrence, it seems. Not that there's any direct connection at all, but what's going on here with 14 people at a Christmas celebration of some sort being gunned down in the middle of the day?
I don't think we know.
Yeah.
I really don't think we know. There are just questions. The husband's the shooter, who was the husband, his own brother, if he's to be believed, and I don't see why not, didn't have an inkling. And I suspect neither did most of his co-workers, except for the one Greek-American fellow he had an argument with over whether Islam was a peaceful religion or not.
Well, you know, this comes at a time, obviously the last few weeks we've been talking about the possibility of Syrian refugees being settled in the United States. And these would obviously be people who are coming from the Middle East. In this instance, it doesn't seem that the couple that committed the murders in San Bernardino were from, well, he's a United States citizen. She's Pakistani. Well,
And his parents are Pakistani.
And his parents are Pakistani too. And they went, it seems, to Saudi Arabia to meet and get married, not to be indoctrinated into ISIS in the Middle East. But it seems that perhaps this has happened in the United States. They're self-radicalized. The New York Times is reporting today that she declared her allegiance to ISIS on Facebook.
Malik?
Yes.
Yeah.
And which adds another dimension to this. It's this is a different battle than whether people come to the shores of the United States or not. These are people who are already here, who are citizens.
I think another question is with regard to Malik. All right, she spent time in Saudi Arabia, I suppose, as a servant.
Right.
did she pick up the Wahhabi brand of Islam while she was there?
She's here legally, though,
Right.
and
Oh, yeah,
she
yeah,
went
yeah.
through the
All the
security checks in order to have a provisional green card.
Yep.
And 2 of the 4 guns were also purchased legally. And there is some question about motivation still, right? Whether this was workplace dispute, terrorist act, some hybrid of both. So I don't want to jump to the connection with Syrian refugees, and I certainly don't want to suggest that they're potential terrorists, but clearly something failed in terms of the background checks. And given that they had an arsenal, this attack was obviously planned, and we don't know whether it was the only attack that was planned.
Well, the other 2 weapons were also legally purchased, the assault rifles, but by someone else. And they're still trying to work out how these the 2 killers got their hands on the weapons. But they had they left 3 tied together pipe bombs at the scene of the shooting. They had 12 more at home.
Yeah.
And they brought 1,600 rounds of ammunition with them, but had another 3,000 rounds at home, which suggests at least that this was not a case of the husband snapping at this party.
Not at all.
Right.
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 But the other thing is, I don't think the Syrian refugees ought to be, well, part of our conversation, but I don't think they ought to be an issue. First of all, Syria is not completely Muslim. For one thing, they're Maronite Christians, and it's the Eastern Mediterranean. Pakistan is Southwest Asia.
I mean, the problem, let's say that we had the most perfect border security and investigations of potential refugees. It's the people who are, it's Native Americans. It's people who are here, people who wouldn't make an airplane. They couldn't fly.
Yep.
You're not on the no-fly list. You don't fly. However, you can still walk in and collect all the weapons you can afford, and create your mayhem that way. It doesn't have anything to do with immigration or security like that. We have that guns available to religious zealots, terrorists, garden variety criminals. Anybody who wants them has them at their fingertips.
Well, and what is it going to take for us to get gun control legislation or gun control executive order if Congress isn't willing to act? Background checks, right, for purchasing guns. Also, there are discussions now about having a threshold for the number of guns that can be sold by a licensed dealer. And then I'm thinking back, the Charleston shooter, Dylan Roof, and the issue there was the 3-day waiting period for the background check. If the background check wasn't completed in that period, the sale went forward. So that's a staffing processing issue. And the number of shootings that we have talked about on this program, right? And today we have 2 in a single week,
I'm not
suggests the urgency.
And we have asked that very question, what will it take? We've asked that before on this program.
I'm not speaking against gun control when I say this. I think we should have certain kinds of laws. But I think that we're going to be stuck with this problem. I think it's part of what we've created for ourselves, and we're going to have to live with it. It's a terrible thing to say. But even if no more guns could be sold legally at this point, there are now so many out there that for a person who really, really wants one or more to get them is not that big a problem.
Right.
And the people who are likely to be most zealous about securing them are the ones perhaps who want to use them. we've got a lot of people in this country who are, we live in a politically polarized era. That's part of it.
Sure.
You know, we don't know what really made the guy from the mountains of North Carolina tick, and we certainly don't know what was going on with these two people. And Dylan Roof is, you know, entirely different.
They have the internet in common in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yes.
Social media and this
Everything-
self-radicalization. The material is there to help
comes
you.
with a price,
Right.
and I think this is part of the price.
Yeah, even though Deere was a recluse of sorts, and we've seen the pictures on the news of his cabin and his trailer, he was very active online.
Well, and remember the Unabomber?
Yeah, that's right.
Another loner.
That's right. Same
Yeah.
part of the country. Well, I think these are still unfolding stories, all three of these that we've talked about today, so we'll come back to them as necessary. Thank you for joining us on The Academics. We'd like to hear from you. Please contact us with our questions and comments at watchtv.com. Until next time, I'm Paul Gates.